Good day, everyone. This is part 3 of the Armenian-American Perspective. And we have back with us again Martin Harutyunyan from Watertown, Mass. As you know, a first-generation American-Armenian, meaning he was born here, his parents were from abroad. And also we have our honorary Armenian-American, Elias Gerosulis of the Livingston Group, who himself is of Greek heritage. I think many of you are familiar with the Livingston Group at this time. If not, they are the lobbying firm that National Democratic Alliance of Armenia has hired to represent Armenian interests in Washington. Of course, Elias can get further into it. And Elias, being of Greek heritage and having Armenian friends outside of the National Democratic Alliance, is quite familiar with Armenian issues, Armenian concerns, struggle for liberation, and so forth. So I think we should start right away because they both had the privilege of being with Gerai Sefilian when he was in Washington in April of 23. Elias, of course, had arranged the meetings, and Martin was serving as a translator. Let's start with Martin. Can you give it, since you were there firsthand, without divulging any top secrets, can you give us an insight into how those meetings were, what they felt like, who you met with, what was the reaction, and so forth?
Yeah, well, it was my first time meeting both Elias and Gerai Sefilian. So I really got to know both of these individuals in the time that we spent together, and it was interesting being in Washington, meeting with top government officials, and you know, those people that don't know Gerai Sefilian, he is an incredible individual. I would have to say he is the hardest working person I have ever met in my life. He's nonstop. He doesn't rest. The only time he rests is when he gets the sleep that every human being needs. Other than that, he is on the go and is very persistent, and it's inspiring. Gerai Sefilian is an inspiring person. I think any Armenian that gets to meet him and gets to know him, I think that's the one thing that will definitely come across is how inspiring he is and how dedicated he is to the Armenian national cause. I'd be interested to know what Elias thought meeting Gerai, and you know, what his impressions were.
Absolutely, man. Thank you. I just want to say I'm greatly honored to be here, and I want to congratulate you, Grigor, and NDA on this new English program series. This is really something that's very groundbreaking, and I think it's going to become very important in the coming months and years in terms of shaping the narrative. Regarding Colonel Sefilian, this was also my first time meeting him. I never met him previously. Of course, I read about him and did my research after we were hired, but I really, you know, this was my first time meeting, and I didn't know what to expect. But I agree with Martin's assessment. I think he's a remarkable individual. I was extremely impressed by him on a personal level, just the way he carried himself. He's a very serious and sober individual. And we spent a tremendous amount of time together, both in the meetings, but also outside the meetings. Because, you know, before we had these meetings, we had extensive discussions of what should be said in the meetings. So I really got to spend a lot of time with Colonel Sefilian during his stay in Washington. And I have to say, he did very well in the meetings. And keep in mind, this was Colonel Sefilian's first time in the United States and in Washington, D.C. Had never been to the U.S. before. And also, he's one of the few Armenian political figures to have had meetings in Washington, D.C. Very few Armenian heads of state have even come to Washington to meet with policymakers. And I have to say, for someone who's done this for the first time, he did extremely well. He carried himself well. I could tell the people we spoke to respected him, responded well to him. He did very well in the meetings. And this is an important point, too, I want to make for your audience. A lobbying firm can open doors. We have access. We have relationships. We can influence to a significant extent. But it is also up to the client, right, to impress who we're introducing the client to. Even if we're the most influential lobbyists in Washington, if we have a client who comes across very poorly, that's going to be noticed, and that will hinder the effort. So it takes two to tango, and it's been helpful in our efforts to have people of remarkable stature like Colonel Safilian who leave a good impression. So that's also another point I want to make clear to your audience, that yes, the lobbying firm has influence and we play a critical role, but also you need a client who's going to present themselves well and impress whomever we're introducing them to. So I have to say, I have nothing but good things to say about Colonel Safilian. Very impressive individual, and look forward to seeing him again at a future point.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. He was very well received and highly respected by the Congress people that we met. That's for sure.
Especially the ones with the military background, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a certain camaraderie between them, and it was very impressive. It was really impressive. My humble part was just serving as translator, but to see that interaction, and it was if it had been somebody else, perhaps there might not have been that same camaraderie and reception that Girard Safilian got. Girard Safilian basically made his point, made it very clear, and he was respected. He was respected, and they were listening. That's for sure.
Was there any, Elias, if I could jump in, so it doesn't seem like we're sugarcoating Girard Safilian, because obviously I don't need to be told that. I have the utmost respect for him, and I think he's a one of a kind. He's probably the handful of true Armenian patriots that we've had during these past 50 years, especially. I don't want to go back too far, but let's say in the past 50 years. Was there any, because I believe he had over a dozen or so meetings in general, maybe even more. Yeah,
I think at least a dozen.
At least a dozen. Was there, and I know Martin was there for several of them. You were there for all of them, Elias. Did you notice anything negative? Anything that can be, maybe negative is not the right word, anything that can be worked on for future meetings that American congressmen or senators would want to see that we didn't properly, or excuse me, Colonel Safilian didn't properly deliver?
That's a very good question. First of all, I think it's important for the audience to understand the context of this. This is really the first time something like this has occurred. As I've said, it's very rare for Armenian government officials, the leaders of Armenia. There have only been a few times where they've even come to Washington to meet with high-level U.S. officials. So to have a politician or political personality come to Washington and to have a lobbying firm do it, I mean, this was the first time an Armenian entity had ever hired a professional lobbying firm. So I think this was new for Colonel Safilian, and also completely new for the congressman, because what they're usually used to is having, let's say, these Armenian grassroots groups come to Washington to discuss Armenian genocide. To have an Armenian political figure using professional lobbying firm to meet with these officials to discuss substantive issues of bilateral U.S.-Armenia relations and security issues is totally different. So I just want to set the context for in that respect. And what I would say, and what I appreciate about Colonel Safilian, I think it speaks to his leadership, is, you know, before we went into any of these meetings, we had preparation sessions where we would discuss what he would say. And, you know, I think part of the job of the lobbyists is not only opening doors, but, you know, we also provide a lot of strategic counsel, including helping with messaging. And, you know, during our private conversations, I would help Colonel Safilian craft his message. And I was also very honest with him. I told him certain things he wanted to say just would not fly. Because, you know, again, if you're coming from one culture that has a certain way of thinking, you know, something that over there might seem totally acceptable might be taboo here, or could be totally misconstrued. So there were a few things where I explained to Colonel Safilian, you know, you might think, you know, this might be well received in Armenia, but, you know, the congressman's going to be totally bewildered if you say it like this.
And cultural nuances, so to speak.
Yeah, cultural nuances. And to his credit, he listened, you know, to my advice, and because of that, we avoided any incidences that could have been misconstrued. You know, I don't want to get into obviously too much of the specifics of our conversations when we had but like one thing, for example, that I can speak to, that I've counseled both Colonel Safilian and any other NDA leader who's come to Washington. I could just give this as an example for your audience. You know, and this is something we spoke about, Grigor. You know, coming from, let's say, in the Armenian culture or even the Greek culture, there's a certain tendency towards conspiracy theories, or there's a certain allowance for speculation. And in fact, I think I told you this, I think there's a poll saying that Greece was one of the most conspiratorial countries in the world. And we've had our private jokes about some of these different theories. So one of the ways in which there could be a potential miscommunication is something that might seem as reasonable speculation amongst an Armenian audience can come across as a, you know, crazy conspiracy to a U.S. congressperson. So this is something that I've explained to NDA leaders whenever they come to Washington to say, hey, you know, stick to the facts. And if you have certain theories about whatever the issue might be, you know, preface it by saying, hey, here's what I think might be potential theory. So, you know, that's just one example of something that I've communicated as to avoiding issues with the messaging, just to give you something tangible.
And
no, sorry.
Go ahead, Martin. Yeah.
No, go ahead, and I'm going to ask a question.
Okay, no, because I was actually going to get to some of the questions, so you go ahead first.
No, well, one question that I had for Elias was, you know, you've obviously seen how Armenian groups have worked in Washington up until this point, up until NDA right. becoming active in lobbying in Washington. Would you define that as lobbying, what those other groups were doing? I mean, you know, if you had to put things into context, if you had to compare and contrast between, you know, what's been happening in Washington up to this point and what's been happening in Washington since you and the NDA have been working, how would you define that?
Well, that's an excellent question.
Interestingly enough, sorry, let me. So that actually was one of the questions.
One of your questions.
So,
yeah.
I mean, similar to it. So maybe Elias can answer both. Right. I guess once, you know, I gave the introduction a couple of days ago that Elias was going to be on board and that he's also familiar with the Armenian-American community. One of the questions was, how do you view, and this kind of ties in, so maybe you can answer both Martin's question and this follower's question at the same time. How do you view the Armenian American community that you have interacted with personally? And what are their shortcomings and what are their strong points? So, if you can-
Right.
A lot to cover there.
Yeah, I can speak to both, and let me answer both of your questions. Now, the Armenian-American community is very large, very dynamic, extremely passionate. Very engaged. They do a lot of grassroots activities, including protests and so forth. So if you could say on the positive side, you could say, passion, energy, activism. But where it's totally lacking, biggest weakness is strategy. And if you're passionate but you have no strategy, you're just going to end up going in an endless circle. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happened. To be successful in influencing policy, which is what the goal of lobbying really is, number one, you need clearly defined goals, right? Number two, you need to understand what the tools for achieving these goals are. And unfortunately, I think the biggest weakness that I've seen in the Armenian-American community is that there's no understanding of either of these two categories. The only clearly defined goal that I've seen, and I've had extensive interaction with the various Armenian-American organizations. I know them very well. I've had tremendous interactions, but there seemed to be no clearly defined goal, with the exception of the Armenian genocide recognition. And that's a whole nother topic that we could talk about, where there are issues there. So no clearly defined goals beyond the genocide recognition. Number two, also a lack of understanding the tools available. There are huge distinctions between professional lobbying firms, grassroots advocacy groups, public relations firms. It's very nuanced. There are a variety of tools to use, and there seems to be a complete conflation between all these things. So if you don't know what your goals are, and you don't know what your tools are, and you're just throwing money willy-nilly, not knowing what you're doing, you're going to keep going in a circle. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happened for the past 30 years. And I think the reason why NDA has been so successful in such a short period of time is an understanding, having clearly defined goals, and number two, understanding what the tools are and utilizing the tools very well, which is our relationship. Now, in terms of answering Martin's question about lobbying and advocacy, these are two separate things. So, for example, in the case of the Livingston Group, what I would say to your audience is this to make it understandable. Similar to how a client hires a law firm to navigate the legal process, clients hire lobbying firms to navigate the U.S. political process. And lobbying firms like our firm typically consist of individuals who have a wide array of experience with the U.S. government, including former members of Congress and administration officials. So the founder of my firm, for example, is former Congressman Bob Livingston, who is a very prominent congressman for many years. And the lobbying firm provides multifaceted value to the client, in this case NDA, including contacts, expertise, and an understanding of the U.S. government and the political process. Unlike a lobbying firm, a community advocacy or activist group is funded by the grassroots membership of the community. So, for example, the Armenian-American community funding these grassroots activist groups, which promote issues in Washington, which have primarily been genocide recognition. I think both the professional lobbying firms and diaspora groups should be utilized to advance the Armenian interests, but there has to be an understanding of the distinctions between these different groups. And unfortunately, I have not seen that. So, the money that's being spent, have been on these advocacy groups. That's not professional lobbying. I'm not saying there isn't value to it, but there needs to be understanding that these are distinct, very distinct things. And so I think that's really been the fundamental weakness is there's really been no time where it seems like people stepped back and said, okay, what exactly is it that we're doing? Instead, it seems like more of, okay, let's react emotionally and throw money at all these different things, not knowing what we're doing. So again, I apologize if that sounds a little harsh, but I wanted to give an honest assessment of what seems to be the issue. And I hope this has answered both of your questions, and I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I guess as a follow-up question to that, and we could start with Martin, because as we said, up until now, it's been, if anything, more advocacy, and it's been limited to genocide recognition, not even reparation, simply recognition. So putting that aside, Martin, how would you portray or explain to our viewer what, and as Elias said, that you know, the first thing you need is a strategy, an objective. Well, actually, an objective and then a strategy to get to that objective. What would you say, in your words, Martin, is NDA's objective in general? Forget about lobbying, and then to add the second layer of that, what is their objective using Livingston Group in Washington, D.C.?
Right. Well, you know, up until now, basically in Washington, we've had the Armenian National Committee of America and the Armenian Assembly. And again, what they've been doing is basically genocide recognition. And now that that's done, I mean, for all practical purposes, you know, the genocide is recognized. Turkey hasn't recognized it, of course, but that's another issue. One thing that, you know, we were doing in Washington was, you know, Armenia needs viable allies. We need to have connections. Armenia needs to be connected and have an ally like the United States and other democratic Western countries. So this I think was very important. And you know, one thing was that I thought was interesting is, you know, in our meetings with these government officials, oftentimes they were wondering, like, so when are they going to bring up the genocide issue? But that's not what we were there for. So that, you know, that alone is it's like a 180-degree turn from what we've seen before.
And what they've been used to hearing.
Right, exactly.
Martin, also, I would love to hear in terms of, again, I have had my interactions and my impressions. Perhaps being outside the Armenian-American community gives me a different perspective. Do you have any thoughts in terms of what I've said, in terms of my experience and my assessment as to, you know, what the problem has been? Because at least to me it was clear, but
no, I agree with you. I think your assessment is spot on. In terms of, you know, what has taken place up until now. You know, the only thing that I'm going to bring up, and it might be an uncomfortable topic, is, you know, when we did approach Livingston Group and hired Livingston, we did get some criticism. You know, I'd like to hear. I'm sure you heard some of that. I'd like to, you know, give you an opportunity to address that, if possible.
Right. I think part of that issue is, first of all, I think there were, without going too much into it, I think there were ulterior motives in some of those criticisms.
Precisely.
I think the establishment, to the quote unquote establishment, if you would, who've been kind of exploiting the Armenian-American community, did not want to see, you know, from their perspective, competition. I've never viewed it as competition. I think, you know, we all need to be in this together to push the issues. There's so many levers of the U.S. government. You know, no one group can cover everything. So I think we should all, you know, be working towards common cause. But I don't think that's the way everyone else necessarily sees it. And so I think there were some bad intentions in terms of, you know, some of these criticisms. But what I would also, and this is important, you know, I think it's critical, and that's why I'm doing these interviews, for the Armenian-American audience, to educate them about how our political system works, and to really start thinking more strategically rather than, you know, going just based off of emotions or this or that. And again, I'm not saying this, you know, I don't mean to stereotype or anything, but I think one of the challenges, you know, and I see this with the Greeks as well, is sometimes rather than responding in a methodical or logical way, they sometimes have an immediate emotional reaction to something. And, you know, especially, you know, we really need to start by we, I mean Greeks, Armenians, we really need to start approaching Washington in a very business-like way, with logic, with reason, and not just impulsively reacting to things. Because on the other side, with Turkey, they're master diplomats. They're very professional. And so we have to really step up our game. But to answer your question, lobbying firms, as I said, they're similar to law firms. And, I know many lobbying firms who've lobbied at different points for opposite interests. So I know lobbying firms that have lobbied, or lobbyists who have lobbied for Pakistan at one point, and then later on they're hired by India. There have been lobbying firms that have lobbied on behalf of Turkey, then they were hired by Greece. These are all real life examples. And, same way, one person might hire a law firm one day, another person might hire a law firm another day. The lobbying firm works the same way. There is a rule that you can't have conflict of interest. So you can't, for example, represent Greece and Turkey at the same time, or Armenia and Turkey at the same time. But, once you end a relationship with one client, you could then engage in a relationship with another client. So that's the way I would explain it. And this is very common in Washington, D.C. And by the way, Turkey and Azerbaijan, between them, past 30, 40 years, I think they've hired almost all the top lobbying firms. Anyone who's good, they've hired at some point. So if the Armenian mentality is going to be, we're not going to work with anyone who might have, been hired by Turkey 40 years ago or something like that, well, then you're severely limiting yourself for no reason. And the opinion of many people in Washington have changed in the past 20 years. People who were pro-Turkey 20 years ago are now some of the strongest critics of Turkey. So I would just say that it's important for the Armenian community to have a practical approach when it comes to their dealings in Washington, D.C. If the attitude is a self-righteous one of, if you've ever had, a pro-Turkish position even 30 years ago, we think you're scum and we're not going to even work with you, then you're defeating yourself. You're your own worst enemy. And there's no logic to it. So that's what I would say. I don't know if you have any thoughts to that.
Well, to give a harsh example, if you're a murderer, you're going to try to get the best lawyers out there to get you away from life imprisonment or the chair. So along those lines, and the state of Turkey and the state of Azerbaijan, as far as I'm concerned, are murderers. So they're going to go after the best lobbyists they can. Number one. Right. Number two, the more lobbyists they get at the same time, as you said, they're limiting Armenia's power. Not that Armenia has done anything, for them not to hire them, because then it would be a conflict of interest. Right. And it's been said, but I think it should be repeated, that we were fortunate enough that the Livingston Group, through the works of Elias specifically, got us a deal in layman's terms for pennies on the dollar, the rate that we got it. Otherwise, the NDA would not have been able to hire such a lobbying group of that stature. And because we have, I know the time goes by very quickly, we have less than 6 minutes left. So one thing I wanted to address for our viewer, because I think we have to assume that some of our viewers, hopefully some of our viewers, are not just regular followers NDA, but maybe new people. Right. I think it's important to address that objective. And the objective is deoccupation. So yes. NDA has been, we've had the premise that Armenia is occupied. Occupied by who? For 70 years by the Soviet Union, the past 32 years by the Russian Federation. But it's still the same Kremlin. So unless we are no longer occupied, whether it's genocide, territorial integrity, and now what's been talking about, snow cleaning in the streets, every single issue that Armenia faces is because we are under occupation. We are not masters of our own domain. So until we deoccupy, we can't do anything. And that is the premise that NDA is setting forward to get away. And fortunately, just the way geopolitics have been in the past couple of years, I think the world now realizes that Russia is nothing but an occupier, which has benefited us, obviously, with the great, I don't want to say popularity, the infamy of the war in Ukraine. I think the average person knows what the horrors of Russia was. Ronald Reagan called them the evil empire 40 years ago. There was the Cold War. So this is nothing new. During Eisenhower's regime in 1959, he had set up Captive Nations Week. And the captive nations were all the nations that were under Russian influence, which Armenia was one of. So this thing is nothing new. But unfortunately, whether it's the Armenian leadership or the Armenian advocacy groups, they have shunned away from talking that. Now we can go into theories whether they were in cahoots with Russia or they were just ignorant, but that's what it was. So that was one thing that I wanted to make clear to the viewer, that is what NDA wants, the occupation, and they want the US's assistance in doing that. If each of you could sum up on any way you want, whether on this topic or something else, for 1 minute each. Martin, you want to go first?
Well, I just want to say that the work that Elias is doing is very important. But in order to get this work done, we need funding. So I just want to encourage all of our listeners out there, if they haven't done so already, to make some kind of contribution, no matter how small or how large it may be, to help fund this endeavor, because it's important. It's important work. It's lobbying that has never been done before, and it's important lobbying. And if maybe Elias can just maybe in summary say what's going on right now, where we stand, what we're working on, what we might be doing in the future. I think that might be of interest to our listeners too.
Thank you so much, and Martin, I really appreciate that. It's a very, very thoughtful of you to say that. I have to say, I've been astonished by, we're coming up on almost the 1-year anniversary of beginning our lobbying relationship with NDA, and I have to say, what we have achieved has even surpassed my most optimistic expectations. I'm shocked by the momentum that we've got in Washington, D.C. We've been able to arrange for multiple hearings on the plight of Nagorno-Karabakh in Congress, especially with Congressman Chris Smith and Tom Lantos' Human Rights Commission. We've arranged for, and this is really notable, Congressman Joe Wilson and the Congressional Helsinki Commission met with NDA leaders, Colonel Safilian Arapapian and Gero Yugnukian, Grigor's brother, in Yerevan. Which was very significant because usually U.S. government officials are careful about meeting with opposition leaders on foreign soil in order to avoid offending the host government. So this was really groundbreaking to have a congressional delegation meet with foreign political leader, opposition group on Armenian soil. I mean, this has never happened before. And then Congressman Wilson then wrote a letter to Colonel Safilian. I mean, when was the last time you've even seen members of Congress write letters to the leaders of Armenia, let alone opposition figure? And then, back in December, a well-known think tank, the Quincy Institute, did an entire report on Armenian Azerbaijani lobbying, and NDA and Livingston Group were prominently highlighted as the main lobbying forces versus Azerbaijan, which has had a long history of actively lobbying Washington. And that again is historic. When was the last time an Armenian political party or even Armenian leaders were highlighted in think tank reports? So I'm just and there are many more things I could talk about, but I am.
We'll do it for the next time.
Yeah. But I'm extremely excited about what we achieved so far, and we have many big things that we're working on. So what I would say, building upon what I've already spoken about, is some with lobbying especially, it takes a while because you have so many important people in Washington who have influence, Congress, administration officials, the think tanks, non-governmental. I could go on and on. It takes a while to get people educated and to build the momentum. But I think we've had an acceleration of momentum, especially in the past 3 months. I talked about the Joe Wilson meeting, the Quincy Institute report. We also got Congressman Darrell Issa, very important congressman from California, to write questions to the State Department about NDA specifically. And these are questions that are on the record. They're on the congressman's website. People can look them up. And that's also very notable because, again, when was the last time you've had members of Congress writing to the State Department to highlight a political party in Armenia? I don't think that's ever happened before. So we've had tremendous momentum, and those things build upon each other and accelerate the progress. So I think we're going to be able to achieve more things more quickly in the coming year. Without getting to too many of the specifics, I could just highlight some of the things that NDA has made public as to topics we brought up in recent conversations. So for example, we've brought up the case of Varunjan Avatisian to senior members of Congress, specifically Congressman Chris Smith, and was involved with the human rights issues. And Grigor, I actually would love, if you don't mind, I would love for you to share with the audience what your impression was, because you attended a lunch we hosted for Congressman Chris Smith at our offices at Livingston, and that was actually the first, from what I understand, the first political event of that sort that you've attended. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. We've also raised the issue of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and their lack of coverage, and we're hoping to get that issue resolved. So there are a lot of things that we've been bringing up, and we're hoping to have some resolution on over the coming months. And your audience should stay tuned. I think they'll be pleasantly surprised by the things we'll be doing in the coming weeks and months.
Sure. Well, I'll very briefly, as far as Congressman Smith, I was quite impressed by him. I was impressed by his vigor, and he touched on human rights issues, everything from El Salvador to Armenia. And you could tell, at least I could tell, I got the feeling that he wasn't just being a politician. They were very, very dear to him, these issues of human rights violations. And when he heard of Varunjan Avedisyan's case, he made sure that his office would follow up. Now, obviously, things like this it's not a snap of a finger and it's resolved. But the fact that he's on the radar of, if I'm not mistaken, he's been a congressman at this point for 40 years. So definitely a senior member of the House. For it even to be on his radar is already an accomplishment. Luckily, I felt like, even though I'm probably the last person that would be involved in political meetings just because of my nature, but fortunately, coming from the same geographical area, having somewhat, we even shared a few anecdotes with each other. So I think the little bit of time that we had, the personal interaction that we had, I think said a lot. And unlike Sefilian, who may have not known the specific nuances of American culture, I can say I specifically, knew the nuances, especially of New York, New Jersey culture. So I think that helped in the relationship. He was very receptive to the objectives of the National Democratic Alliance, and even more so specifically for Varunjan Avedisyan's case. And the one thing that I think a lot of these congressmen have in common is that they understand the danger that Russia poses in that area, and specifically to Armenia. And as many of us have said in the past, I think it's also important to note that, because people say, oh, the naysayers, well, what's America going to do? America's not our friend and this and that. It's not about being a friend. We're not buddies in a playground. It's about mutual interests. The United States does not want Russia to be a stronghold in that region, nor do they want China to be a stronghold in that region. And that's for military purposes as well as for economic purposes. And in both those cases, they realize that they need an ally. And Armenia is that ally. Armenia is that nation that has a great diaspora, an educated diaspora, an influential diaspora in the United States, and for that matter, all across the world. So all we need is a government that wants to serve Armenia's interests. And that is where the lobbying efforts come in, because they will hopefully make that into a reality where we will have a government that serves Armenia's interests. And once we have a government that serves Armenia's interests, we can form that strong alliance. Because for decades, I remember as a child, it was fed to us by Armenian organizations. Oh, we're small, we're weak, we're landlocked, we have no natural resources, and so on and so forth. And of course, as I got older, I realized these were nothing but, whether intentionally or unintentionally, tactics to demoralize us, as opposed to saying, okay, well, if we're landlocked, we got to find a way to the sea. Or if we're small, all the more reason we need stronger friends. Otherwise, if you just accept those as axiomatic realities, then you might as well just commit suicide and call it a day. And that is what NDA and people like Varujan Avidisyan and G.R. Sefilian have been doing for decades at this point, and trying to get our people, our nation, out of this demoralized, undignified state, and saying, yes, you can always get out of that situation that you are in. And for the past 5 years, we've been on we, meaning Armenia, has been nothing but on a downhill spiral. And it still can get out of this situation. I know it will happen. I believe it will happen. The question is, how much more damage will we allow this Levon, Robert, Serge, Nicole regime? Because we know it's all a daisy chain. It's like a relay race. One just handed the baton to the other. Nicole is the one taking it to the finish line, but Serge handed him the baton. So I equate it to a relay race. And until we put an end to that, we're just going to see more human loss, more territorial loss, and just more emotional loss. And that is what we need to stop. And it is going to be stopped, because the civilized, strong Western world simply will not allow it. But there's so much that they can do if the de jure Armenian government is not allowing it. A lot of people say, well, why didn't Armenia step in and stop the September 19th ethnic cleansing, evacuation, genocide, and any one of those fit the pattern? I think the US, and I remember the brief conversation with Congressman Smith, he shared that the US has learned, the one great thing about the US is that it has done many mistakes over its 250 years. But each and every year, it realizes its mistakes and it tries to better itself. So the mistakes that it did 100 years ago in Latin America, or even 30 years ago in the Middle East, the US is realizing not to do that. So if the US just ignored Pashinyan's government and came in guns blazing, it would be considered an aggressor, because then Azerbaijan and Putin and Erdogan would just say, look, they're the aggressor. So however, if the Armenian government had the wherewithal or the patriotism to actually say, look, this is what's happening, we need your aid, just like Zelensky did in Ukraine, or now Netanyahu is doing in Israel, or other countries that are being that are in the midst of a war, they reach out, and then the US either decides to help or they don't. But we have not reached out. At every corner, our leadership has asked for the Russians to have a stronger mandate. It is the NDA that is saying, let's reach out. So the United States and France, those are the two main ones, are in a very awkward situation. They want to help, but they're not given the means to help. So the only reason that we are not in a much worse state, I believe, is because of the, I don't want to call it backdoor tactics, but the more subtle tactics that France and US has used. But once we have a government with Armenia's interest, I firmly believe that things could turn around overnight. It doesn't, they say Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was in a couple of years. It wasn't decades and centuries. One of the interviews that NDA gave, I forgot who it was, they mentioned how after World War II, Japan and Germany were rebuilt with the help of the US. And that was 70 years ago. For a nation as small as Armenia, for it to be rebuilt, we're talking about a couple of years. It's not this tremendous Herculean task. It can be done. You need and as you said, Elias, you need the strategy and the proper objective. So that's my input on that.
Elias, you were speaking about working with Girar Sefilian. And obviously Girar Sefilian is not the only person you've worked with. You've also worked with from the National Democratic Alliance. You've worked with Arap Papian, who also is a very well established diplomat. You've worked with David Grigorian, and I was just wondering if you could tell us about some of your experiences working with these gentlemen as well.
Well, with David Grigorian, we're talking every day, multiple times a day, and you're talking about someone who works nonstop and is always working. David, like Colonel Sefilian, is one of those people. I don't know how frankly, I don't even know how he does so much, and I think we're extraordinarily blessed to have him. David was critical in establishing the lobbying relationship to begin with. We were friends before I had even become involved with NDA, and he was the one that dragged me into NDA, so to speak. And he was just so passionate about NDA, and he infected me with that passion as well, so to speak. So it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to work with David Grigorian, who's also a very dear friend, and Ambassador Papian. He's another remarkable individual, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, walking encyclopedia, you could say. And he also did very well in terms of his meetings in Washington. We took him to meet with a wide variety of people back in December, and he did very well, and we had many productive meetings. So I've immensely enjoyed my relationship with Ambassador Papian, obviously with David, who I've known for several years. I have to say this, from my personal experience, I've been extremely impressed with all the people I have met in the NDA orbit, whether it's Colonel Sefilian, Ambassador Papian, or the NDA supporters here, whether it's David Grigorian or Grigor or you, Marn. You're all very thoughtful, well-spoken individuals who are very impressive individuals. So I think it says something that NDA is attracting top quality people to its cause. So I've had nothing but a positive experience.
Thanks for the kind words.
Yeah.
I also want to touch on, when I did the introduction video, this is a slightly off topic. I chose to use, I said there's an interesting Armenian-American, which is Arshavi Shirakian. And I don't know if you guys got a chance to see it. I read an excerpt from his autobiography. And Arshavi Shirakian, for those that don't know, he was a part of Nemesis. He was one of those that brought both the Turkish organizers of the genocide, as well as the Armenian collaborators of the genocide, to justice. Of course, at that time, it was risky to say the least, because unlike the Nazi hunters, where they had a government behind them and it was all done legally and state sanctioned, when Nemesis was doing it, it was all done secretly and behind closed doors. And the reason I bring that up is, as horrible and it is to say, among the people that were brought to justice were many with Armenian last names. I don't call them Armenians because I don't think they deserve to be called an Armenian. And Arshabi Shirakian, one of the first people that he took out was Vahe Yesayan, who has changed his name to Vahe Isan, who was in the Constantinople police force, and he was actually responsible for compiling the names of the close to 500 intellectuals that were gathered and then murdered on April 24th. And Shirakian actually, at the age of 20, went to the organizers and he said, "I'd like to take out this guy." He did that as well as many others. And then when they finally were able to get him out of the area, he arrived in Paris, I believe in 1922 or 23, and they offered him housing and so on and so forth. And he said, "No, I'm done." And he came to New Jersey and settled in northern New Jersey, and thus became an Armenian-American. And I think then the reason I brought that up, aside from him being an Armenian-American, so that's one Armenian-American's perspective. Also, I should add, and Martin could probably add into this, the core of the Nemesis was actually based out of Watertown. So a lot of the logistics, and we have to remind, this is before SMS and Viber and WhatsApp or phones for that matter. So everything was, the amount of work that was done, and it's unbelievable that even a film hasn't been made about this yet, or at least a good quality film. It's unbelievable what they accomplished. So it was Armenian Americans that, albeit for a short period, this is immediately after the genocide, immediately after World War I, when Armenia was probably at its lowest point with disease and so forth. But these group of men were able to maintain our dignity, say that we're here to stay. The ones that are a threat to the state of Armenia, whether their name is Talyat or Vahe or Hamayag, which was another one of the enemies with an Armenian name, they were brought to justice, and it will be done now. And again, the reason I bring this up now is to point out that it is the job of all Armenians. It is not just the job of Giray Sefilyan and Arap Papian and Garegin Chugazian and Varujan Avedisyan, or all the supporters that are now in the 6th month in the streets of Yerevan. It is also our job here in the US, as it was the Armenian Americans' job here in the US 100 years ago, to bring the enemies to justice. Martin, do you want to add to that at all?
Well, I was just thinking, you named quite a few of the members of the National Democratic Alliance, and one name you left out, I'm sure not intentionally, was Vahe Gasparian, who is just here, who also is an incredible individual. The man is a surgeon, and his command of English is also very good.
If I can add, I'm sorry, he's a heart surgeon that I recently found out that has innovative techniques that are attributed to him that are even being used internationally.
Right, right.
So yeah, so he's almost a Renaissance man. Not only does he have a great command of English, of Armenian and Russian and
Right,
French, and I
right.
recently found out Italian.
Yeah.
He gave an
Oh, wow.
interview to an Italian newspaper in Italian. So yes, Vi Gasparian was left out completely unintentionally.
Right.
Okay, Martin,
No,
go
no, I
ahead.
know. But the fact of the matter was that he was here in the United States recently for the telethon. We had a telethon, and again, another thing, a first of its kind. But again, I just wanted to stress the importance of funding. That things like telethons, we need funding in order to get our mission accomplished. We need funding. That's the bottom line. I think we really need to get that message out there so that, again, people that are listening in maybe for the first time, realize that, these things just, yes, I'm volunteering my time, you're volunteering your time, all of these people are volunteers, but there needs to be funding to get this work done.
Right, and I just want to touch upon. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even though Livingston is kind enough to provide their services for a heavily discounted rate, but it is still a rate.
There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch.
It is still a rate, and to add to that, something that the state of Armenia, with their budget, should be doing. Instead, it's being done by a grassroots organization that is in a media blockade, is being attacked from all sides, of course, directed from Moscow. So the resources, whether human resources or financial resources, are extremely limited. And unfortunately, as Elias has said many times, one of the first phrases he told me he learned in Washington was "money talks, and you know what walks."
Right.
And to follow up on Martin saying, yes, it is each and every Armenian that has given, and this time we've had people who have given $2 from Armenia. They've given 1,000 dram, which is a little bit more than $2, and we've had as much as 10,000, and every single thing in between. And it's each one of those, and it's important to point out, because the people are the ones giving, NDA's responsibility becomes to the people. Unlike the other, almost all political organizations in Armenia, where it's being funded by some oligarch or another. So therefore, their allegiance is to that oligarch, not to the people. So we have an allegiance to the guy who gave $2, to the guy who gave $100, the guy who gave $1,000. And I'm sorry, Elias, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to go to your point and to on Martin's point, I think one of the biggest challenges and also the biggest misconceptions is, I've heard many times, Armenian Americans saying, well, Turkey has the resources, they're spending millions of dollars on lobbying. We just don't have the resources. With all due respect, that's a bunch of utter nonsense. It's not that, Turkey has some special right to hire lobbying firms and Armenians can't hire lobbying firms. A lobbying firm, as I said, it's like a law firm. If you're willing to pay them, they'll work for you. And it doesn't matter who it is. And I think one of the biggest issues is that Armenians do have tremendous resources. Both the government of Armenia and also Armenian Americans, many of whom are successful business people who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I think the problem is it's not an issue of resources, it's an issue of priorities. So whereas Turkey's been spending money on lobbying firms, public relations firms, doing all sorts of things to gain political influence, you see the wealthy Armenian Americans are instead spending millions of dollars to, put their name on a church or a school, or, spending millions on genocide documentaries. I think we talked about how Kirk Kerkorian, again, very well-respected Armenian business person, he spent almost $100 million on a movie. So if just some of those resources were allocated strategically, I think the Armenian interest could be a powerhouse in Washington. I think the biggest issue is that there are millions of dollars that are being just thrown around left and right with zero strategy, based off of, I don't know, self-promotion or emotional impulse, or I don't know what exactly is going on. But there really needs to be, before more money is thrown around, some strategy. People have to get these rich Armenians into a room and say, hey, instead of throwing the money around, not knowing what you're doing, we're getting no return on investment. Let's try to think strategically. And hey, instead of spending $100 million on a documentary, maybe take, 5 million of that 100 million to spend it in Washington on lobbying and the things that are going to, promote our interests here.
Instead of using government funds to invite Snoop Dogg, maybe we
right, or the Armenian government. Armenian people say, oh, Armenia is a poor country. They don't have the resources. Some of the poorest countries in the world, forget about the rich countries, the poorest countries in the world, spend millions of dollars on lobbying in Washington. One of the clients my firm used to represent, not now, but in the past, was Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the world's poorest countries. We were just one of, I think, at least 5, I think it was more like 10 lobbying firms. They're spending $5 million a year on lobbying in DC, and they're one of the world's poorest countries. So to say Armenia is just too poor, that's not, especially they want to give Snoop Dogg $6 million. They just spent over $20 million on a new embassy in the UK. I mean, it's absurd. So, we have to dispel this notion of there aren't any resources. No, there are resources, but they're being totally misspent on God knows what in both the diaspora and the Armenian government. It's crazy. Martin, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I thought I'd bring this up, and maybe this is a bit of a controversial topic, but
no, I mean that's why we're here. We're not trying to sweep stuff under the rug. And I think Elias touched on a good thing, getting the priorities, and I think we could all agree on that. But yeah, Martin, what would you say? So, I mean, it's easy for us to, because we're on the same bandwidth to say what the priorities are. How do we get the message across to those other Armenians, whether the wealthy businessmen or even the average middle class Armenian, that hey, if you're going to give at this point, especially in January of 2024, if you're going to give your hard-earned $10 or $50 or $100, should you be giving it to, and no disrespect to these organizations, whether it's Children of Armenia Fund or the Armenian Tree Project or the Armenian Eye Project, or all these things. And again, I don't want to knock them, but what is of the utmost importance, and how do we convince those people that they should, how they should allocate their hard-earned funds to?
Well, I think there needs to be a shift in the way a lot of Armenian Americans perceive things. For decades, many Armenian Americans saw Russia as our protector, and many, unfortunately, still do. They still think that Russia is our protector. So there needs to be a shift. I mean, it's quite evident Russia is not our protector; it's our enemy.
Russia is not even its own protector, let alone ours.
Right, exactly. So, again, it's through what we're doing, like just this being out there on YouTube, or and being accessible, where people could hear another side, another opinion. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of resources for American Armenians to find out what's going on in Armenia. They're not as easily accessible, particularly because of language barriers. Unfortunately, a lot of Armenian Americans don't have a grasp of the Armenian language, and therefore can't get the latest news and really be attuned to what's going on there.
Which is why we're doing this in English.
Which is why we're doing this in English. And not only us, but also NDA in Armenia is putting a lot of informational videos up on YouTube on the NDA channel. So again, I encourage everybody that's listening to us to check that out, and to really get a, to really understand what's going on in Armenia now. So yeah, there definitely needs to be a shift, and in terms of what Armenian Americans are thinking and seeing, and where they're getting their information from.
We're down to a few minutes again, or about 8 minutes. What I'd like to ask is to leave the viewer with a concrete notion. If each of you can give just one or two concrete examples of why Russia is not our protectorate, starting from there, and part B of that question, why is it important to form an alliance with the West, which is what we've been saying. But if we can get to a specific why, so it can be something tangible to that American Armenian that may not be as
well. I mean, I think it's pretty evident. I mean, we saw it in September. Russia is supposedly our protector, and now we have Artsakh without Armenians. So what kind of protector is that? I mean, there's that. I don't even think that's a question.
Well, but even I get it, Martin. But even let's say for the real layperson, because that's a very good point. Because per the November 9th agreement or declaration, November 9th, 2020, the Russian quote unquote peacekeepers, which is an oxymoron, but they were there for the safety of the Armenians, and they failed miserably starting in December of 22 when they allowed the blockade. So I guess again we're saying it at a second grade level to the viewers that just trying to grasp this. So if nothing else, by the way, this year marks the 300 years anniversary, if you will, when Russia first started its campaign of Armenia without Armenians. That was started in, if I'm not mistaken, July of 1724. I know it was 1724. I don't remember the month. During the reign of Peter the Great. So we are in the 300th year of this, but Martin very correctly said we only need to go back 4 months. We don't need to go back 100 years. So as far as that, so now tied in with that, why is it, and again, it might be obvious, but let's state the obvious. Why is it important to form alliances with France or US or India or Greece, for that matter?
Right. Again, we know we have to have viable partners. Again, United States is not going to do something out of the kindness of their hearts. It's a question of mutually beneficial interests. Armenia has something to offer, and the United States has something to offer, and that's where this this synthesis needs to take place. And what we're doing is we are creating that bond, we are creating that bridge. And I don't want to talk too much. I'd rather let Elias. I'd rather allot my time to Elias for him to tell us, what he and Livingston Group is doing to make that bond.
Thank you. That you said is very well put. Yeah. Yes, Elias. You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll be concise. Armenia really has a golden opportunity right now. Now is the time, because for a long time, the United States was heavily reliant on Turkey to be its projector of influence in Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Caucasus. But most people here in Washington know how unreliable Erdogan is, that he's turned to the East. He doesn't believe in the West. He's an Islamic fundamentalist who, wants to recreate the new Neo-Ottoman Empire and so forth. So the United States is trying to diversify its security architecture in the region, and not be totally reliant on Turkey. In a way, kind of replace Turkey through upgraded relations with other countries. They've done that with Greece, as you highlighted.
Even though Turkey, because one of the things we hear from the naysayers, Turkey's NATO. So if you could touch on that as well, Elias.
Right. Well, Turkey's NATO, but that doesn't mean that they're a friend of the United States. You know, that's a very illogical, or with all due respect, sophomoric way of thinking to say, well, you know, Turkey's in NATO and U.S. is in NATO, therefore U.S. loves Turkey. That's a bunch of baloney.
It's a logical fallacy. It's a
logical fallacy, right? You know, the United States has already taken many steps to decouple from Turkey, including now, you know, they moved many of their assets to other countries like Greece, which now is over 8 U.S. military bases and facilities. So the U.S. has basically replaced Turkey with Greece, Cyprus, and other countries in the Balkans in terms of being countries that could project U.S. interests in North Africa, the Balkans, even the Black Sea. If you look at you know, U.S. activities in Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth. Where the U.S. still needs the Turkey is really projection into the Middle East and the Caucasus, right? Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus. So if Armenia could become an ally of the United States, it could then fulfill that need. And the U.S. really would no longer have to be subject to the whims of Erdogan, who, as we know, is very mercurial and is always trying to extort things out of the United States. So I think the U.S. government, similar to how they made deals with Greece and other countries, would love to make a deal with Armenia, because it would really relieve the headache that they've had to deal with in terms of this whole Erdogan problem, which is something that people in Washington have always talked about. So Armenia could get itself a really good deal. The only thing that's holding up Armenia is obviously the successive Armenian governments that have been totally wed to the Russians, and also the lack of the lobbying in Washington. People who could be interlocutors between the Armenian interests and the U.S. government. And so I think our role is critical in terms of, for the first time, establishing that professional lobbying presence. And I look forward to when hopefully our friends in NDA come to power, and we could really make a massive shift in U.S.-Armenia relations. But until then, we're at least laying the groundwork.
In a very unprecedented way, we might add, right?
Very
Breaking new grounds daily.
And this is important because, as you know, creating a lobbying infrastructure, which again has never existed. The Turks have been working with lobbying firms for 30 years, so they know how it works. They know how the lobbying work works. They know how to work with the lobbying firm. This has never been done in the Armenian space. So, we're creating that infrastructure. We're creating that relationship. And so we're basically laying the groundwork. So by the time, let's say, NDA does come to power, it could hit the ground running. It's not like we're going to be reinventing the wheel. People in Washington will already know about NDA, and NDA will already have the political apparatus in Washington as it takes the helm of the Armenian government. So, we're in many ways laying the ground. We're having an impact now, but also laying the groundwork for that future moment.
Thank you, Elias. Thank you, Martin. I think we stopped right in time. And I'm glad we continued with the second one, and hope to see both of you soon. And
absolutely,
yeah. Thank you, Gokor, for hosting us again. And yeah, looking forward to our next conversation with our next guest.
All right. Be well and good night.
You too.
Bye now.
All right. Good night.